Hello students, Mr. Bastias here. Welcome to Unit 6, Week 1, Day 1. Make sure you have your article a day, your word detective map, your book of knowledge, and paper and pencil to write with. Today we will learn about the successes of an African American astronaut, Guyan S. Bluford Jr. Let's get started. Hopefully you're watching this in February, which is Black History Month here in the United States, where we celebrate the accomplishments of African Americans. I want you to look at this picture. I hope you will recognize at least one of these people. And I want you to choose one African American hero in this picture and share with your friends how this hero changed the world. Take a moment to do this now. I, of course, picked Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a civil rights activist who fought for the equality of Black people in the United States. Who did you pick? Please take out your word detective map. In your word detective map, we have the word part, ed. When you add ed at the end of a word, you can make a noun into a verb. And as a verb, you can make it an action that happened in the past. Have you seen this word part before? What are some words you have seen use it? What do you think it might mean or do? Here are some words that I thought about. Talked, walked, and screamed. All of them have ed at the end. If you talk to someone, it means you talked to them in the past. If you walked by someone, it means you walked in the past. And if you screamed at someone, it means you also did it in the past. So here, when I added ed to these verbs, I made them happen in the past. Today, we're going to focus on another word. Protest. Protest is a verb or an action. When you make a protest, you say that you think something is wrong, or you do something to show that you disagree with something. For example, a woman named Caroline LeCount staged a protest on public transportation. If we take the word protest and we add ed at the end, we make it into protested, which means something said forcefully or complained about in the past. For example, lots of people protested about the new working hours. In this picture, we see people that protested for civil rights. Does this look or sound like a word in another language? It looks like the word protestar, which means to protest in Spanish. Let's get started with our article a day, breaking barriers in space. Have you ever wanted to be an astronaut? An astronaut is a person who flies in a spacecraft and works in space. In Spanish, we say Astronauta. These are pictures of astronauts. Take some tips from the first African American person in space, Guyan S. Bluford Jr. This is a picture of Guyan S. Bluford Jr. Before Bluford was an astronaut, he was a pilot in the United States Air Force. He flew more than 140 missions during the Vietnam War. After years as a pilot, he went back to school and got a doctorate degree in aerospace engineering. Look at this picture of Bluford in an aircraft. He was a pilot in the United States Air Force. Soon afterward, Bluford applied to be part of NASA's astronaut training program. More than 10,000 people applied along with him. NASA chose Bluford and just 34 others to train to be astronauts. It was a very difficult program, but Bluford made it through. He was set to go up into space. Have you heard of NASA before? They send astronauts into space. Bluford applied to be an astronaut and got chosen out of 10,000 people. Guyan S. Bluford Jr. boarded the Challenger in August 1983. He was surprised to see so many people watching the spaceship launch. A launch is the act of sending something into the air with great force, or the act of starting something new. In Spanish, we say lanzamiento. This picture shows the launch of the spaceship into space. It was rainy and the launch was set to happen around 1 a.m. Still, there were people outside watching. They wanted to see this historic moment. Once the spaceship launched, the crew listened to the astronauts' voices. Did you notice that they added ed to the word launch? That's because they're talking about it in the past. They could hear someone laughing. Who was it? It was Bluford. He said, "I laughed and giggled all the way up. It was such a fun ride." Look at this picture of Bluford in space. He said he laughed a lot during the launch because it was such a fun ride. Once Bluford and the other astronauts got into space, they started doing experiments. An experiment is a careful test used to discover or understand something that is not known. In Spanish, we say experimento. You may have done some experiments in your science class. Astronauts are doing experiments in space because astronauts are also scientists. One of the most important experiments was seeing how space affects the human body. This work would help future astronauts who would be in space for a much longer period of time. Bluford did experiments to see how space affected astronauts' bodies so that people could potentially spend more time in space. Bluford flew into space 3 more times before deciding to stick to Earth for good. But his love of space travel continues to this day. Now he talks to people across the country. He shares his stories about space and experimenting in a whole new environment. Bluford didn't just go to space 1 time, he went to space 4 times and did experiments in space. Now he doesn't go to space anymore, but he talks to people around the country about his experiences in space. Please take out your book of knowledge. Write down 2 or 3 things you learned from this article and would like to remember. Pause the video and take a moment to do this now. I'm going to go back to my article to find information that I can add to my book of knowledge. The first thing I learned is that Guyan S. Bluford Jr. was the first African American in space. The first thing I learned is that Guyan S. Bluford Jr. was the first African American in space. I also learned that while he was in space, Bluford conducted experiments. I'm going to write that down in my book of knowledge. I learned that Bluford conducted experiments in space. Notice that I also added ed at the end of conduct because it happened in the past. So he conducted experiments. This makes me think of studying the solar system in science class because it was about astronauts. So this makes me think of the solar system because the article was about astronauts. Remember your word detective map? We had protest, and then we added ed at the end, made it protested, which makes it into the past. What other word could you add to your word detective and make it into the past? I added the word launch, and then I added ed at the end to make it launched, because the rocket launched in a rainy day in the article. And that's it for me, students. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.